The encounter in the dark. In the silent expanse of deep space, Captain Blake Holden sat at the helm of his lone vessel, the Vanguard. The hum of the engines was a steady reminder that despite the isolation, the ship was alive. It cut through the black void of the sector like a ghost, on the tail of a shadowy mission that had begun with a simple yet unsettling transmission, a signal from a derelict ship adrift in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. Blake had been hired to investigate. But as the space around him stretched endlessly, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a routine operation. His eyes narrowed, studying the coordinates one last time. The mission was straightforward. A derelict ship, possibly a smuggling vessel, was floating in neutral space. Rumor had it that it was transporting illegal goods, and the Galactic Coalition had wanted it checked out. Blake didn't ask questions. His job was to retrieve any valuable data and report back. But there was something about the way the signal had cut through the static, like a beacon calling to him. It wasn't just any abandoned ship. Blake had an eerie feeling deep in his gut. He'd been in this business long enough to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him this wasn't going to be a simple job. His fingers danced across the controls as he guided the Vanguard closer to the abandoned vessel. It loomed ahead, a dark and massive hull slowly drifting in the cold emptiness. Its systems shut down, a hushed tomb in the void. The ship was old, probably decades, maybe more. Blake could see the cracks in the hull and the telltale scorch marks of a ship that had seen some serious battles. No one had bothered to salvage it. There was no sign of life. Yet something about it felt off. His mind wandered to the possibilities. Illegal weapons, contraband tech, maybe even black market artifacts. He'd seen it all before in his line of work. A quick grab, a quick payout, and back to the safety of human space. That was the routine. But he couldn't shake the sense that something dangerous was waiting for him behind that thick, sealed airlock. "Rhea, lock onto the ship. Let's see what we're dealing with here." Blake spoke into the comms, addressing his ship's eye assistant, a calm, collected voice that had been his loyal companion for years. "Locked on, Captain. I am detecting minimal energy signatures from the derelict. There is a power leak in one of the lower chambers, but nothing significant. No signs of hostile activity," Rhea responded, her voice echoing in his headset. Blake took a deep breath and nodded, though the feeling in his chest remained. With a flick of his wrist, he aligned the Vanguard with the derelict's airlock. The ship's engines groaned slightly as he matched the drift of the ancient vessel. The air around him seemed to thicken, charged with a strange energy he couldn't explain. He could feel his heart rate picking up. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. He grabbed his equipment, his blaster, his emergency kit, and fastened it securely to his suit. He stood, adjusting the shoulder straps of his armor, the weight of the gear comforting him in its familiarity. The ship's small cockpit felt confining now, and his pulse quickened as he stood up from the captain's seat. The door to the airlock hissed open as he entered the small hallway. His boots made an unmistakable sound on the metal floor, but he moved quietly, trying to mask his presence. The ship had been abandoned for a long time, but that didn't mean it was empty. As he made his way through the dark corridors of the derelict, Blake couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. It wasn't just the strange readings from the sensors. It was something more primal, a sense that something was watching him, waiting. He turned down a narrow hallway that led to the cargo hold, the place where he'd find whatever valuable contraband lay in the bowels of the ship. His mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Illegal weapons, forbidden alien tech, maybe even slaves. The door to the hold slid open with a soft hiss, and Blake froze. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes adjusted to the low emergency lighting. In the center of the large, dimly lit room stood three figures, frozen in place. At first, Blake thought they were statues, tall, humanoid, their skin a deep, rich blue that shimmered like polished metal. But then, one of them moved. The figure was a woman, She had long black hair that cascaded over her shoulders like a river of midnight, and her eyes glowed an unsettling, brilliant gold. They fixed onto Blake with a piercing intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Blake's hand instinctively moved to his blaster, his fingers tightening around the grip, ready for a fight. But he hesitated. These weren't human beings. They were something entirely different. The tallest of the three stepped forward. She was regal, her posture commanding, despite the heavy, metallic collar locked around her neck. It pulsed with a soft, blue glow. Blake could feel his heart rate spike as the woman's golden eyes remained locked onto his. "Who are you?" Blake demanded, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. His eyes darted between the three figures, taking in their strange clothing. Simple brown fabrics, barely more than rags, which contrasted with the oppressive sophistication of their restraints. "We are Yuans," the tallest woman replied. Her voice was distorted, like it came through a filter. But even so, there was a strange cadence to it, something almost musical. "Yuans," Blake repeated, his brow furrowing. "I've never heard of your species." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "We are unique, and we are in your debt. Will you help us?" Blake's hand wavered, unsure whether to draw his weapon or lower it. These women were not just prisoners. They were something else. There was something in the way they carried themselves, a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. But Blake's mind raced. What had he gotten himself into? These weren't the typical criminals or smugglers he was used to dealing with. This was something entirely different. He had a job to do, but his moral compass was already turning in a new direction. These weren't just slaves. They were something much more. "Why were you brought here?" Blake asked, his voice softening slightly. "Who did this to you?" The woman's eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of something dark crossing her face. "The Drari Syndicate," she replied, her voice full of quiet venom. "They see us as tools, but we are more than that." Blake's mind raced. The Drari were known across the galaxy, a ruthless, dangerous criminal organization that operated in the shadows. If these women had been captured by them, it meant they were valuable. More valuable than Blake had originally thought. "How you know I'll help you?" Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind was already working, weighing the options. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The woman tilted her head, her golden eyes glinting with something unreadable. "You will. Because you understand what it means to be free. And if you don't help us, the Drari will come for you too." Blake felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of the situation was settling in. The decision he made here would change everything. There was no going back. The choice of freedom. Blake stood in the cargo hold, his pulse rifle still resting loosely in his hand. He could feel the weight of the situation sinking deeper with every second that ticked by. The three Yuans, these strange, captivating women, stood before him, their golden eyes never leaving his. The air in the room was heavy, charged with the promise of something life-altering. Their presence was undeniably compelling, and for reasons Blake couldn't quite put his finger on, he felt a pull toward them. But there was no time to analyze it. He had a job to do, and that was to collect evidence and report it back to the Galactic Coalition. But it wasn't that simple now. The leader of the three Yuans, the woman who had spoken first, stepped closer to him. Despite the heavy metal collar around her neck, her movement was fluid and graceful, almost predatory. She didn't seem like a prisoner at all, but rather someone accustomed to command. The other two, Adara and Kira, remained silent, their golden eyes watching Blake intently as if waiting for something. An action, a response, an answer. "Are you going to help us, Captain?" The tall one asked again, her voice carrying the same strange echo, like it was traveling through a distorted filter. Despite the mechanical distortion, there was an intensity in her tone, a quiet confidence that made Blake hesitate. "I don't even know who you are," Blake replied, his voice low but steady. His fingers tightened around his pulse rifle. Wands. What is that? I've never heard of your species. The woman tilted her head slightly, a small but almost imperceptible gesture that spoke volumes. We are not from your world. Our kind is rare in the galaxies, you know. But we are not your enemies. Blake's eyes narrowed, and he instinctively took a step back, his mind racing. The Yuans were clearly not human, but there was something about them, something about their presence, that didn't sit right with the usual categories of the galaxy's inhabitants. There was a raw power to them, one that Blake could feel despite the physical restraints they wore. Then why were you captured? Why were you sold into slavery? Blake demanded. He took another cautious step forward, his eyes scanning their faces for any hint of deception. He didn't like where this was going, but the idea of rescuing anyone, even alien captives, was far from simple. Smuggling, he understood. Slavery, though, that was something else. The woman's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Blake saw a flicker of something akin to pain, something raw and personal, before her expression hardened again. We were taken by the Drari Syndicate, she said, her voice colder now. The Drari are ruthless. They see us as tools, not people. Our abilities, our empathic abilities, are valuable to them, but they don't understand us. Blake's mind was racing. He'd heard of the Drari Syndicate, of course. No one who had ever worked in the fringe sectors of the galaxy hadn't. They were notorious for trafficking in forbidden technologies, rare minerals, and worst of all, slaves. Their reputation for cruelty was legendary, but empathic abilities, that was new and dangerous. You can read minds? Blake asked cautiously, though his tone was laced with skepticism. He had dealt with enough unusual technologies to know that there were often more questions than answers. The woman shook her head slowly, her expression thoughtful. Not exactly. We can sense emotions. We are attuned to the feelings of others, able to understand their intentions and their desires without them saying a word. But it is more than just reading emotions. We can project them, influence them, help others understand what they truly feel. But she trailed off, her voice softening slightly. The collars suppress that. They block everything. Blake looked down at the heavy metal collars that encircled their necks. They pulsed with a faint blue glow, almost as if they were alive. He studied the technology for a moment, his hand subconsciously reaching for his blaster again, though he didn't point it at them. There was no immediate threat. But the thought of these women, these beings with such strange powers, being confined by this technology unsettled him. I could take the collars off, Blake said quietly, his voice more to himself than to them. But not here. Not without the proper tools and a safe place to work. We have a place, the tall woman replied quickly, her voice firm. We have a safe location, a place where we can be free. Will you help us, Captain Blake Holden? Blake's chest tightened at the mention of his full name. How did they know that? He hadn't said a word about himself, had he? His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to find a logical explanation, but none came. He stared at them, the weight of their gaze making him feel vulnerable. I don't know what you're asking for, Blake muttered, more to himself than to them. Why should I trust you? For all I know, you could be luring me into a trap. This whole thing could be a setup by the Drari. Do you think we would go to all this trouble for a trap? The woman interrupted, her eyes narrowing. The Drari want to control us, but they are not the only ones who want us. If you help us, we can give you something more valuable than anything you will find in that hold. Blake paused, glancing at the other two women, who remained silent, still, and unreadable. His gaze flicked back to the leader. And what would that be? Information. Intel on the Drari. She nodded, her golden eyes burning with an intensity that made Blake take an involuntary step back. More than that. We know things. Things about the Drari. Things about the galaxy that you wouldn't believe. But you must help us first. Blake felt a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, everything about this situation screamed danger. If he helped these women, he would undoubtedly make enemies of the most dangerous criminal syndicate in the galaxy. On the other hand, they were right. The Drari were ruthless, and their tactics went beyond the norm. Their interest in these women, these ones, suggested they were far more valuable than just some slaves. If what they said was true, helping them could offer far more than just a personal win. It could change the balance of power in the galaxy. Blake exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained with the weight of the decision. "I've got a lot to consider, and you're not making it easy." "Consider this," the woman said, stepping closer, her voice soft but compelling. "The Drari are not the only ones after us. There are others, worse, more dangerous factions that want to use our abilities for far darker purposes. You can help us, and in return, we will help you." Blake's heart raced. He was no hero, but there was something about their plea, something about the way they carried themselves, that made him question the path he'd been walking for so long. His world had always been black and white. Find the job, get the payment, and move on. But this was something different. "Fine," Blake said, a note of finality in his voice. "I'll help you, but we do this on my terms. I'm not going to get caught up in something I can't control." The woman smiled, a subtle curve of her lips that managed to be both enigmatic and thankful. "Agreed, Captain Blake Holden. Agreed." As Blake led them through the derelict ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something far bigger than any of them could understand. And whatever came next, it was going to change everything. A dangerous bargain. Blake felt the weight of the decision settling over him like a heavy cloak as he led the three Yuans down the dark, narrow corridor of the derelict vessel. His boots clanged against the metal floor, the only sound breaking the silence that had enveloped them since they'd agreed to work together. The women moved with a grace that seemed at odds with their restraints, their collars still pulsing faintly with a soft blue light. Blake glanced back at them, unsure of how to feel about the decision he had just made. The tall woman, Nara, walked ahead of him, her posture straight, shoulders squared. There was an undeniable aura of command about her. Behind her, Adara and Kira followed, their expressions unreadable, their golden eyes studying Blake with an intensity that made him feel as if they could see straight through him. He could sense their curiosity, their intelligence. These were not simple slaves. But what they were, what they had been through, was still a mystery. "Where are we going?" Blake asked, his voice low, cutting through the quiet. They had reached the airlock, and he was beginning to feel an unsettling sense of urgency. The Drari could be on their way, and time was running out. "We have a safe location," Nara replied without turning, her voice steady. But there was something else in it now, something that hinted at a quiet desperation. "A place where we can be hidden, where you can remove these collars. If we stay here any longer, the Drari will find us." Blake's mind whirred as he keyed in the access code for the Vanguard's airlock. He wasn't sure he trusted them completely. The Yuan's strange abilities, their calm demeanor, it all seemed too perfect, too calculated. What if they were manipulating him? What if he was making a dangerous mistake? "You said you have information," Blake said, trying to steady his nerves. "What kind of information?" Nara's golden eyes flickered toward him, her gaze sharp. "We know the Drari. We know their operations, their networks. We can see what they want before they even know it themselves. But we are not just a tool for them. We are more. We are something they could never control." Blake remained silent as they entered the airlock. He had been through enough shady dealings to know that everyone had a price. The Yuans had a reason for trusting him, and they were clearly willing to bargain with him for their freedom. But the question was, what did they need from him, and what would they do once they were free? He ushered them inside the cramped Vanguard, the small ship seeming even smaller with three strangers now aboard. The interior was clean and utilitarian, designed for efficiency over comfort. Blake moved to the pilot's seat and began initiating the pre-launch sequence, but his mind was still on the women behind him. "You're not just slaves, are you?" Blake asked, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the ship as it came to life. "You said you're something the Drari can't control. What does that mean? Why are they after you?" Nera hesitated for just a moment, the silence growing heavy. "Our kind possesses abilities. Empathy, yes, but it goes beyond that. We can sense emotions, influence minds, heal wounds, but there are others who seek to exploit us for darker purposes." Blake's fingers paused on the control panel, his curiosity piqued. "Heal wounds," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "And you think you can do that? What with your abilities?" "Yes," Nera answered softly. "But not all wounds can be healed with touch. Some go deeper than flesh." Blake studied her face, trying to detect any sign of deceit. But there was nothing. Just a quiet intensity, the same intensity that had drawn him to them from the very beginning. "And the Drari, they want to control you. What for?" "They want us as tools," Nera said, her voice tight. "We can manipulate emotions. We can read minds. But we are also capable of influencing entire populations. The Drari are not interested in us for what we can do for them. They want to weaponize us. They want to use us to further their empire. If they succeed, it will be the beginning of something much worse than anything they've ever done." Blake's hand hovered over the controls. "So this isn't just about money," he muttered. "This is about power." Nera's eyes met his, and there was a heaviness in her gaze. "Yes, power. The Drari are a force to be reckoned with, but they are not the only ones who seek to harness us. The Coalition, the Zantari, and even the Sheshka, they all know what we are capable of, and they all want to use us for their own gain. But we are not theirs to command." Blake sat back in his seat, processing everything she had said. A small part of him wanted to believe it. After all, what reason did they have to lie to him now? But there was another part, one that didn't trust easily, that remained skeptical. These women were powerful, dangerous even, and they had been forced into submission for a reason. Blake wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing by helping them. The Drari were ruthless, and there was no telling who else might come after them, or him, if he got involved. As the ship's engines hummed to life, Blake steered the Vanguard away from the derelict vessel, watching the fading lights of the abandoned ship disappear into the vast, empty void of space. They had made their decision. There was no turning back now. "So," Blake said, glancing back over his shoulder, "where exactly are we going? And how long until the Drari come after us?" "We have a contact," Nera replied, her voice almost imperceptible over the hum of the ship's engines. "A man who can help us. He's not far from here. But time is short. The Drari are never far behind." Blake tightened his grip on the control yoke. He didn't need to be told twice. He had no idea who this contact was, or whether they could actually remove the collars without triggering some kind of fail-safe, but it was the only lead they had. And right now, he was their only hope. As they neared the jump coordinates, Blake turned his attention back to the women. They were sitting silently, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their golden eyes shimmering in the dim light of the cabin. It was clear that they were more than just prisoners. They were survivors, and in a way so was he. Blake had seen enough of the galaxy to know that power was a double-edged sword. But these women, these Yuans, held the key to something much greater than he had ever imagined. The question was whether he was ready to unlock it. The ship lurched slightly as it entered hyperspace, the stars around them stretching into long streaks of light. Blake glanced at the stars, then back at the Yuans. He couldn't help but wonder just how much deeper this rabbit hole would go. For the first time since he had agreed to help them, Blake allowed himself to wonder what they were really capable of, and whether the galaxy was ready for what they might unleash.